Welcome, everybody. Welcome. For those who are following us on live streaming, we are broadcasting from the ICTJ. Welcome to all the attendants, those in Tataouine. Today, we have the first workshop from a series of workshops on in transitional justice, dealing or entitled how to dealing with the legacy of the governorate of Tataouine in the area of human rights violations and marginalization. We have held a previous workshop on transitional justice in the region, and we have come up with a number of recommendations from the participants. And there was also the municipality of Tataouine who was present, and some representatives of local government. We remained in contact with each other, and there was much focus on the characteristics of Tataouine in dealing with marginalization within the framework of transitional justice. So it was within the mandate of the TDC to focus on victim regions and deal with marginalization. After 1 year of hard work and communication with activists and the local authorities and our partners in Tataouine, we came to the idea that Tataouine could be a model, a transitional justice region. And today we are starting the first of the series of transitional justice workshops. So we have 2 sessions. We have an introductory session and then 2 more sessions. One entitled endorsing the right of Tunisians in the region of Tataouine in dignity and justice and reparation. And the second one is designing the strategies aiming at endorsing transitional justice and economic justice and social justice in the region of Tataouine. Today we welcome the son of the leader, Salah bin Youssef, to talk about the victims of the Yusufite and the Bourguibite era. Then in the first session, my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Azars will remind us of the outcomes of the first workshop in Tataouine. We have also our friend Dabi Musa, a journalist from the Alliance and Redress in Tataouine. He will talk about the different marginalized people in the region. Also, we have a guest from Tataouine who will talk about the economic, social, and economic impacts of the violations, the past violations. We have also Mr. Mohammed Haytham Beltaif, civil society activist and a diplomat and ex-diplomat from Sfax online. He will talk about reparation and redress. The second session will be headed by Mrs. Ishraq Ghdiri from Solidar. We will have Mr. Ruben Carranza from New York to talk about the tools of transitional justice, to how could these tools solve the problems of the past violations. And in the second presentation, His Excellency Abdelrazak Kilani will talk about the programs or reparation programs and redress. Then last, Mrs. Thuraya Bakri, who will talk about endorsing good governance and transparency and the mechanisms to endorse accountability and combating corruption and good governance. Now, without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Lotfi bin Yusuf, the son of the leader Salah bin Yusuf. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Lotfi bin Yusuf. I am the son of the martyr leader Salah bin Yusuf, and I would like to thank the ICTJ, and I would like to thank all the attendants, whether online or in person. I would like to correct or rectify some of the misinformation spread in Tunisia for many years. The first responsible for the was the ex-president Habib Bourguiba, the killer. The choice of Salah bin Yusuf to militate against the French colonization was a strategic choice, was an international strategic choice against all international and foreign intervention in our countries. And this choice was made because we were calling for real independence, like, and following Patrice Lumumba and many other militants. What happened in Tunisia from the 50s of the previous century was not a civil war. It was systematic violence from the the voice is cutting irregularly, and we need to show loyalty and faithfulness to the martyrs of the past. These martyrs who sacrificed their lives to oust the colonizer from Tunisia. So the policy of torture and assassination against the Yusufist project of emancipation. Both the contradiction and struggle between Bourguiba and Salah bin Yusuf was not about the political positions, since Salah bin Yusuf was offered too many positions, including prime minister, and he rejected all of those positions because Salah bin Yusuf was convinced that approving and accepting those positions would be a betrayal of the cause. In the 50s, he represented a whole branch and coalition. And in November 1955, Bourguiba and his allies were unable to organize the Congress. And because the majority of the Desturian party were pro-Yusufist, in fact, Bourguiba and his partners chose a systematic policy of assassination against Salah bin Yusuf and his followers. Thank you very much, Dr. Lotfi bin Yusuf, for this contribution. So we will talk about the political differences between the leader Salah bin Yusuf and the ex-president Habib Bourguiba, which caused the marginalization of the governorate of Tataouine. This marginalization has continued for a long period up to the end of the rule of the previous president, whether Habib Bourguiba or Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. This marginalization was accompanied by some practices characterized by corruption, and there were a large number of violations, human rights violations. As Mrs. Salwa Gantari said in the opening of this workshop, the ICTJ moved to in 2019 to the governorate of Tataouine, and there was a meeting with the victims, the victim associations in Gebeli and Tataouine, and there were also the victims of the Armada battle. There were also representatives of civil society in Tataouine, and there were also young people from the youth who have economic and social demands related to employability and finding jobs for everyone, and of course for endorsing transparency and accountability in the region, also the natural resources in the region. The discussion in Tataouine 2019, December 2019, was based on 3 major points: systematic marginalization, keeping memory, and reparation and redress. The discussion lasted 2 days, and we have come up with a number of recommendations and outcomes, including group reparation, commemoration, combating corruption, and endorsing accountability and transparency, and stopping impunity. Civil society in Tataouine their main focus was reparation for all in the region rather than individual reparation. So we have had problems with the sound regularly. We have had meetings and workshops with universities and academics. So almost impossible to translate anything. We can't hear the source. The recommendations we have come up with were related to issues of development, regional
We are also trying to commemorate the history of the governorate of Tataouine and the incidents that happened, especially the 5 main war battles, especially Agri battle. And there are 4 other war battles, and that we should work on in order to commemorate and preserve history. We also work together on the commemoration of the who were killed by the French colonization there. There were also some recommendations to establish cultural centers and memorials to preserve memory in Tataouine. In another point concerning boosting and reinforcing the anti-corruption, transparency, There were few recommendations, especially after the events of Al-Kamur and the popular protests there regarding transparency in the distribution of natural resources, especially petroleum and natural gas. There were also other recommendations in relation to the social and economic issues, especially in relation to the distribution of natural resources, and also making a clear decision to improve the share of these natural resources and the incomes and targeted to the development of the region. In addition to that, there were some recommendations related to security issues and alleviating some restrictions to enter the Sahara. In fact, you need what we call the Sahara card in order to enter into the Sahara and enjoy the nature and the wonder of the Sahara there. There are also other recommendations in relation to the extraction of natural resources, which open new horizons for increasing internal investment, and open also the doors to external investment, and of course with respect to transparency and governance. Another recommendation was related to building a new airport in Tataouine in order to boost tourism and link Tataouine to the rest of the regions. Also another recommendation to link Tataouine in the network of railways with Jerjis and Jerba in order to improve the economic activities and development in the region. Another recommendation was revising the development plans and programs in the government, and also include Tataouine in new projects and new reforms, and also the respect of governance and the best practices of transparency, and also the respect of participatory approach, which open the door to the work in partnership and coordination with civil society and on the one hand, and local authorities on the other hand. These were the main outputs and the recommendations of the workshop that ICTJ organized in December 2019, which had as a main aim to achieve clear recommendations on the region victim, and to consider Tataouine as an example in order to establish a new dialogue between civil society, local authority, and international experts and local experts in order to reach new strategies which are measurable and also which are applicable, new transformative strategies that would help us to achieve clear strategies on the reparation, and also to establish and improve the rights of the government and its inhabitants towards dignity and social justice. This was the main issue related to this workshop, and I am delighted to have with us today Mr. Tataouine, who is a journalist and a member of the Coalition of Rehabilitation and Dignity, who is an inhabitant of Tataouine. Today we will try to discuss the main outputs of the main report of TDC in relation to the collective memory. The floor is yours.
In the name of God, I would like to thank the ICTJ Center in Tunis. Also, I would like to thank you for allowing me this opportunity to talk about this topic and to renew memory, because the TDC committee and the ICTJ talked about the issue, and we are talking about the same issue again and again. And we hope that we will come up to good, to excellent outcomes. I am so glad to have Dr. Ben Youssef with us today, the son of the martyr Salah Ben Youssef, and the president of the ex-president of the Lawyer Association, Bar Association in Tunisia, Mr. Abdelrazak Filani. The region of Tataouine is, from the start, is a resistant region. Resistance started in, there were some major battles in the region against colonization, but the Agri battle was the last battle before independence, because Tataouine was a major participant in the Mada battle during the Second World War. The Agri battle in 29th of May 1956 was a major battle because it was a fight between those who reject internal independence and progressive or gradual independence, and those who would like to accept partial independence. So I have a picture. Even before the Agri battle, some young people from Tataouine in Tunis, in front of the Beylikal Palace, branding the motto or the slogan, long live Salah bin Youssef, long live the Bey. And the Tataouine people felt chained. And so here I am talking about what happened back then in 1956. This region, which contributed a number of martyrs in the Agri battle, 73 martyrs, and many of them are still buried in caves, and maybe some of the wild animals ate them. Why? Because the family members of these martyrs could not bury their martyrs. Initially, we have a request from a group of people to bury these martyrs, but they were buried in a mountain. They would put the body, the corpse, in a cave and block that cave with stones. We still find many of their dead bodies in those caves in the different surrounding Tataouine. The TDC, when they have discussed all these files and visited those caves, and they have even collected a number of corpses. The Agri Mount battle together with Sabat Adlam, or the prison of April the 9th, are major elements and premises in collective memory. Among the outcomes we have come up to, the one which was made by the TDC in December 2018. We need to continue recognizing and identifying the martyrs, and maybe there are new techniques to identify these corpses. But so far, nothing has been done to identify the names of the martyrs. And we we talked to the authorities and we wanted them to identify the identities of the martyrs, but so far we could not do anything because the families of the victims want to know where are the martyrs. Also, we want to dedicate a graveyard for those martyrs. Many of the bones collected were put in big sacks. So they just buried them in small holes in Tataouine in a graveyard. Provided that a dedicated graveyard will be made to these victims, to these martyr victims. And there was a lot of fuss about what happened back then. Also, we need to launch a museum of all these victims, collecting pictures and any document and any thing which is related to these battles. And most of the documents are still in the French archive institution. And France only declared the existence of this archive in 2012. There are attempts together with the municipality of Tataouine to have a museum involving the militant history of the region. The third outcome is a moral funeral for all the martyrs, to rehabilitate these victims and these martyrs, and that provided that the authorities make an official apology for the families. But so far, nothing has been done by the authorities in the region. These are the oral testimonies. We together with the Tataouine radio, we have collected a number of oral testimonies from the people who participated in these battles. Some of them were with us during the meetings, and they gave us their own testimonies, but because of the time lapse and because of all their health problems, some of them died, and some of them died while very poor, and they don't even have a social care card. People in the region are patient, and they have learned to be patient. That's why they are stoic and keep silent about their own woes and their own problems. The second issue is pertaining to the whole country. So all these, the TDC branch in Medellin has been closed down, and these documents were collected and then they were taken by the TDC, and we don't have any trace of them right now. A report, for example, from Tataouine might go to another region. That's why. So the TDC, the decision made by the TDC was collected by some of the victim families or the families of the victims, and they posted them in their houses. Some of the victims died before reparation. And some of the TDC decisions included giving them life pensions. And we know that the outcomes of the TDC work has not been implemented yet. And even the fund, the Dignity Fund, has not been implemented yet. Tataouine has remained since 1956 up to the modern era marginalized and excluded. A secondary school was created only 30 years after independence. This shows how negligent the state was towards Tataouine. Of course, we cannot talk about a university or a college. Health institutions are non-existent, and many of the women who want to give birth have to go to Gabis or to Sfax, and on the way they might lose their lives. And despite the existence of the agricultural sector and the prosperous agricultural sector in Tataouine, but on the ground, the state is not investing in the region. Maybe there is a higher institute for technological studies in Tataouine, but this is not enough. So we need to highlight and focus and endorse our demands, and that the state should apologize for the region. There is an official apology made by the president of the state. After 2011, there were a number of presidents who, in Tunisia, only one of them has apologized for the region. Also, the military zone imposed in Tataouine, this is a problem for us. I mean, you cannot go beyond Ramada unless you have a special authorization from the local authorities. You know, a fifth of the surface of the republic is forbidden to the inhabitants of the region, and that's a problem, and that's a case of living injustice, and we need to deal with that. So this is in short what happened in Tataouine back in 1956. Thank you so much, Mr. Adawi, for this introduction, which builds on the meeting we have had with the victim associations in Tataouine, and we noticed that between 2019 and 2020, the governor of Tataouine is moving towards creating a memory museum in the region, so that to commemorate and to preserve the memory of all the events that happened in the region, and of course to implement the outcomes and the suggestions of the previous meetings. However, before we move to the next 2 points, I want to inform you there is a slight change on the program. Mr. Abdelrazak Hilani won't be able to stay with us after 3:15. That's why I will give him the floor immediately, so that he makes his presentation, which was scheduled later today. Then we give the floor to Mr. Saeed bin Zayed from Tataouine and Mr. Muhammad Al-Taif from Sfax to continue the discussion of the different points related to today's meeting. This change in program was in compliance with the introductory presentation of Mr. Dawi Musa, who talked about reparation and redress and marginalization and exclusion in Tataouine, while your presentation will be about the nature and the conception of the Dignity Fund for a general reparation in the region. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you so much, Azar. In the name of God, welcome to all the attendants. I would like to welcome the son of the leader, Salah bin Yusuf. I would like to pray for him and wish that God blesses his soul. It is a good opportunity to establish contact with the family of the martyr. And it is also another good opportunity to communicate with the people from the region. Of course, we would like to deal with the problems that have been plaguing Tataouine for many years throughout a number of national strategies. I would like to define the concept of victim region. Back in December 2013 or 14, this law, in its article number 10, last paragraph, talks about the victim. And in the last paragraph, it identifies that all the regions which were victimized or which were subject to marginalization in the previous period could be considered as the victim region. So this concept of victim region is the first of its kind worldwide. That's why when Mrs. Gunther talked to me about the issue, and as well as Mr. Azar, as a jurist, I wanted to explore the idea and to investigate the concept of victim region. And the starting point was reparation, group reparation or collective reparation, rather than individual reparation. The legislator talked about the issue in Article 10. And I will talk to you about the decree related to organizing the Dignity Fund. And the question addressed to me, how can the Dignity Fund intervene in such an issue? I do believe that the starting point should be to identify concepts or define concepts, give it a legal definition to the victim region. What is the definition of a victim region? Is it the whole governorate? Is it the delegation? Is it the district? Or the sheikhhood, if you like, or the smaller region. And in the end, the people who investigated the concept of victim region is any geographical location independently of its administrative belonging could be considered as a victim region. The second concept, which was mentioned in Article 10, the principle of the concept of marginalization. Marginalization, according to the definition made by a number of some specialists, it is a violation targeting a number of people, which resulted in decreasing their chances and economic and social chances. So marginalization is related to exclusion, which is to undermine the chances and the opportunities of a group of people, which leads to violation, economic violations and social violations for that particular group of people. This pertains to the social level, to the economic level, to health rights. There is also another concept we need to investigate. Article 10 of the law talks about the process, and every region which was marginalized under the previous regimes and was also excluded. These are practices of the past, targeting individuals and groups. When we talk about the dignity and freedom revolution, these definitions were made by the specialists, and there was discrimination which was perpetrated by the authorities in these regions. And these regions have a number of prerogatives. These are coastal regions. As for the internal regions, like Sidi Bouzid, Gasserine, Tataouine, that's why the people, the young people in the regions during the revolution were branding the slogan work, dignity, and national dignity. This exclusion, to tell you the truth, was prevented these people from getting and they were prevented from entering the job market. These are the concepts which are related to marginalization and exclusion, systematic marginalization and exclusion. Also, there is the problem of, and of course, we need to provide evidence for all these violations, these past violations, in the sound from the source. So these violations targeted individuals and groups. Sorry, again.
And poverty is not only economic, it is social, cultural, and political. It takes the form of depriving from their basic human rights, depriving them from their social and economic rights, preventing them from having access to labor markets, to improve the standard of the Constitution of Tunisia, the Constitution of January 27th, 2014. We clearly that it stipulates in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 rights, Article 12 in Chapter 1 in the general principles, it stipulates clearly that the state should make its efforts in order to establish social justice and the equality between the regions and combat marginalizations. The legislators clearly stipulates these Article 21 stipulating the guarantees of the states that would establish and guarantee decent life. Chapter 2 of the Constitution, or Chapter 2 in the Constitution, related to freedoms and liberties, we find a lot of rights. For instance, the right to health.
In some regions, the level of education for children, because of the limited financial resources, the long distance that they have to walk, there's no education for children. The right to work, as per Article 40, the right to culture, Article 44 refers to the right to water. All of these rights that constitute the main reasons that led us to victim regions. All of these reasons combined have been consecrated by the Constitution in the chapter of rights and liberties and the general principles when it refers to the principle of positive discrimination and the decent living that needs to be provided to the citizens by the state. Then we raise the issue of reparation for the victim regions. Of course, as previously mentioned, reparation within the framework of Transitional Justice Law number 53, there's Article 41 that instituted the Dignity and Rehabilitation Fund, which is supposed to be designed to provide reparation. If we consider individual reparation in clear terms, in the way of providing the modes of reparation, but in the framework decision number 11 of 2018 that was issued by the Truth and Dignity Commission, with reference to this framework decision, there's no article that provides for reparation for victim regions. In this regard, I made recourse to decree number 211, dated on the 22nd of February 2018, and that governs the way of managing the Dignity and Rehabilitation Fund. In Article 4 of this decree, we find that the decree refers to that the fund shall be tasked, the Dignity Fund shall be tasked to contribute to reparation and to provide reparation for the victims of tyranny in keeping with the provisions of Articles 10, 11, 12, 13 of Organic Law number 53. And therefore, the governmental decree did not rule out the victim regions in view of the fact that it brought us back to Article 10, which provides for victim regions that had been marginalized and excluded in systematic fashion. How can the Dignity Fund intervene in view of the fact that so far we have not managed to set up the system or the body that is tasked to provide reparation, individual reparation for the victims? When I addressed the wording provided by the Truth and Dignity Commission on the issue of reparation for victim regions, I found out that there have been many recommendations. There are about 15 pages in the report of the TDC, and they came in general recommendations based on priorities. First, to connect reparation programs for reparation victim regions and developmental programs. There's mention of measures pertaining to some sectors like the agricultural field, strategic measures, some measures pertaining to the industrial sector, to promote social and solidarity-based economy, to promote tourism in certain regions, medium and short-term measures, in addition to recommendations pertaining to infrastructure, to water resources. In my own perspective, the perspective provided by TDC based on surveys, in my own perception, these projects that are likely to provide reparation for the region, victim regions, these are huge projects. We are speaking about hydraulic projects. When we speak about agriculture, these are mega projects. So it's the responsibility of the state that comes into play. The Dignity Fund is enough. If there is part of the funds that will be earmarked, I believe that the Dignity Fund is not enough, actually. But there's something useful. Project. We are speaking about hydraulic projects. The lawmaker intervened by virtue of law number 30 of 2020, dated on June 30, 2020, governing social and solidarity-based economy. This law is mainly designed to achieve balance between the requirements of economic efficiency and the social solidarity purposes, to achieve social justice and fair distribution of wealth, to structure informal sector, to ensure social and economic welfare, and to improve the service delivery. And through this law, the lawmaker has responded to the aspirations of the victim regions, providing them with a legal framework in order to ensure that the region, the victim region, may be promoted and take off from the situation of marginalization that it is enduring. I'd like to reiterate that we are at the beginning of our endeavor, and we are willing to take proposals from the experts as regards the modes of response of the Dignity Fund for the victim regions. There's a legal vacancy here and legal loopholes and a vacuum, and therefore we need to join hands. And I'm sure that the civil society has a key role to play in this regard. That is why I always seize any opportunity, and I know that our colleagues and brothers and sisters in the center like ICTJ and the civil society organizations, I insist on attending all proceedings organized by the civil society, and I'm sure that we will come out with results that live up to the expectations of all the citizens in the victim and marginalized regions. Thank you, Mr. Abdelrazak Al-Kilani, for this outstanding introduction. with this legal, if you like, perspective regarding the Dignity Fund and how it can come into play in terms of collective reparation for victim regions with reference to the recommendations. So we know that some recommendations are, overlapping with the recommendations that we came up with in 2019 in the Tataouine meeting, some recommendations pertaining to agriculture, to infrastructure. You also used some key points, marginalization, deprivation, systematic exclusion that is inflicted against groups and regions in specific geographical areas. When we refer to systematic marginalization or institutionalized marginalization, we are referring to a full-fledged policy that has been adopted and whose result is the exclusion and the poverty and the ensuing global marginalization of a whole geographical region, which is part and parcel of the national territory. Development focus only on the coastal areas. I'd like to link up with Mr. Said bin Said in Tataouine, who will tell us about the social and economic and political long-term consequences resulting from these policies that had been undertaken under the tyranny and the dictatorship, and whose consequence is this systematic marginalization. Mr. Said bin Said, you have the floor. Hello, everyone. Can you hear us clearly? Yes. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ezer. I thank all the staff members of the ICTJ for this opportunity granted to us in addition to the previous opportunities and the meeting. This effort is to be commended and highlighted. But the circumstances are not really appropriate to ensure sustainability and continuity. And fortunately, the coronavirus popped in after your first visit to Tataouine at the end of 2019. But all the thanks and gratitude to ICTJ for keeping up this effort, and of course this effort shall continue in the future. I'd like to thank you and pay tribute to your efforts. I'd like to welcome with Mr. Lutfi, the son of Salah bin Yusuf. I'd like to commend his insights in Tataouine, and Mr. Dawi Musa is more knowledgeable about that and knows about the historical specifics. The entire South has suffered from the fallout of the Tunisian experience that went astray. The people know that the agri battle, which is the subject of many workshops and that will take place in the future, the agri battle occurred on the 29th of May, in addition to other battles. Litherti and Mr. Munsuf will dwell on. These are people who are knowledgeable about history and know the nooks and crannies of historical facts and extreme details. All their experiences combined will result in an outstanding achievement, not just for Tataouine, but for the nation, for the entire nation. The injustice and the prejudice and the scale of injustice inflicted upon many governorates. I know many other governorates also suffered, but at a lesser extent. My presentation shall be concise. As part of my duty as a consultant in the Ministry of the Interior in the Tataouine region, I pretend I have some knowledge since my recruitment in 2000. The developmental endeavor, when you look at it on the ground of reality, it's just 1/4 or 1/5 of the republic. There's some effort for the infrastructure, there's power supply, there's developmental endeavor. There are 4 developmental plans. Some areas have the roads, they have light, and they have power. And this is an effort to be commended, but it was not enough for when it targets just a quarter of the entire territory. I shall focus on the long-term consequences of these developmental policies. We can focus on the academic aspect. Structurally and functionally. Structurally, it's quite easy. We can link up the structural issue within the developmental plans with the area of the governorate as a whole. The area of the governorate as a whole, first of all, the area of Tataouine became governorate only in 1980. That was a late appointment. The state, we understand what happened. If the state had the intention for this region to be like other governorates and not to be subjected to any kind of injustice, as Council and Dean Kileni has referred to, of course, the prejudice I sustained is not to be considered as a marginalized governorate. In my own essence, in my own presence, as a Tunisian state, your nomination of Tataouine as a governorate in 1980 came a bit too late. My colleague Mira has more details. They know what was happening in Tataouine, and everything is documented for the record. I'm not pretending to be the most knowledgeable person in this regard, but the developmental effort has been made, but it is insufficient. I need a developmental plan that is more inclusive and a non-classical plan. Why a non-conventional plan? Because structurally, in view of the geography of Tataouine, it is different from the other governors, because you have a desert, and that desert is full of riches, and nobody comes to assess the richness of the desert. Inestimable value. Just a small comment. Last year, when they inaugurated the gas field, they said that it would be #1 in terms of output in Africa. I think now it's now closed down. We have reserves of gypsies. We are #1 worldwide in marbles. When you dig down and do some rigging, we have some kind of marble that is not classified. Those who have fields, they are the ones who really took it upon themselves. Mr. Dawi Moussi had made personal effort. He traveled to France in order to bring documents unknown to anyone. He published those documents and referred to the reality, certain facts in Tataouine unknown to anyone. They took samples of stones and they carried out analysis to these stones. This is a high quality marble. And this happened in many areas. We have two mountainous areas, and there's a chain of mountains that would hold for hundreds of years and can really yield lots of riches. Now, with regards to the geographical area, in view of the size of the governorate, it has been established late. The number of the counties has not been changed, with just one more county added in 2017. The municipality is inexistent. We do not have municipal constituencies. The municipal coverage is limited to the populated areas, and this is unfair for those who insist on staying in their places of residence. I'd like to link up with the core of what we are dealing with in Tataouine. The battles that Tataouine had embarked on, 5 or 6 battles documented. Dr. Ali, the expert in archaeology, can entertain you more about what we will call it, the Roman Valley. Nobody made any drilling regarding this valley. So it's all pertaining to the division of the municipalities, and then there's an issue pertaining to the reparation of the victim regions. There's an issue when it comes to supplying these areas with sound infrastructure. We need railroad, we need airport, we need underground metro, which is possible if we really talk about genuine development. If we change the developmental paradigm, then the establishment of underground transportation becomes more than relevant. Mr. Dawi Musi remembers very well the Irdenis road, which is known to everyone. The road of the this is a popular road that goes through the Libyan desert. If we can really promote this kind of road, there's an interruption here of the sound.
So all these issues related to the economy and to the social level, in Tataouine, we have not seen any development programs. And unfortunately, this is the sheer truth on the ground. Even if you want to launch an initiative, people from the region who would like to start projects or startups in the region, they are quickly discouraged, and they go back to France or to the foreign country from which they came. Also, part of the consequences of the current situation, things started from independence. We can divide them into two different eras, that of ex-President Bourguiba and that of ex-President Ben Ali. So for the first period up to the late 1980s, And the second era starts from the late 1980s to the revolution. So from independence to the coup, which took place in Tunisia in 1987. And even if that development programs and models have changed, things on the ground did not move a little or slightly. So up to 2006, till in 2005, when there was the Transformation Summit, which was held in Tunisia. So when we want to trace back what was implemented on the ground, we find almost nothing. Last year, because of the pandemic, we have only one healthcare unit, which was also dedicated to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was closed. It has opened and then quickly closed. The companies which were requested by the Kamur sit-inners to have branches in the region, they rejected the idea, and they have a branch which is only a representation of the mother company of the headquarter in other regions, like British Petroleum, which is a huge company, but they have only an informal presence in the region. So all the development plans so far are an accumulation of failures. So after the revolution, we have had high wishes and high ambitions that things change on the ground, but things did not change. And with the inauguration of President Qais Said, we had high expectations that things will change on the ground, but nothing has changed. We have learned from the previous experiences that it is very difficult to change anything on the ground unless we change the mindsets and we change the way the state looks at the region. Things will stay the same. Thank you so much, Salwa Gantari. Thank you so much for inviting me to this meeting, for allowing me this opportunity to talk to you. We have with us Dr. Dawi Musa and Dr. Ali Thabti, and our colleague who is also a jurist and a civil society activist. I welcome all your efforts and I commend all your efforts for the benefit of the region, so that the region is entitled to reparation and redress. The president has already apologized for the region, but the state did not. They did not dare apologize for the past violations. And violations were not perpetrated against Tataouine alone, but against many other regions. So we need to learn and to accept to apologize when violations are committed. So we need to guarantee reparation for all the victim regions, and we need to give the opportunity, full opportunity, to all the experts to talk about what happened before. It's no use, inviting people and having a masquerade like this. I don't want to talk any further. Thank you so much, Mr. Zaid. for joining us today. But for the pandemic, we would have moved to Tataouine and would have organized a meeting or a workshop over there. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. Yeah, this was systematic marginalization and exclusion in the region, which were the result of successive policies and development plans. These policies on purpose marginalized and excluded the region and prevented the region from getting its economic rights. Moreover, with the intervention of the International Monetary Fund in determining economic policies in Tunisia, this might have a positive impact on development in the region. And this is closely related to a basic issue in transitional justice and the outcomes of the TDC. The TDC, who has sent a petition to the International Monetary Fund and to France, two memoranda to talk about the causes of marginalization and exclusion of the region, which were the results of the successive policies and the successive governments in the past. In all these, in the two memoranda sent to the IMF and to France, they covered a number of issues that we have raised today. And it was related to debt, the Tunisian debt to the IMF. A policy which has been implemented since the mandate of the ex-president Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali. This leaves a huge burden on the state and on the country, and deepens social discrepancies, development discrepancies between the different regions. Today, from Sfax, we have Mr. Mohammed Haytham Beltaif, a civil society activist and ex-diplomat, who is trying to analyze and discuss the content of these the two memoranda that the TDC sent to the IMF and France, where it demanded formal apology and recognition and reparation for the victim regions, by the foreign debt by
We'll try to think together of a way of enforcing the content of both memoranda. Mr. Haytham, if you can hear us, please take the floor. After Mr. Haytham's presentation, we shall have discussion. Our friends who are with us online, you may provide your comments on the chat box. And those who wish to ask for the floor after this presentation, please click on the hand sign. And those who are following on Facebook, you are entitled to make comments that shall be discussed during the time dedicated for that rubric. Can you all hear me? Thank you all, the representatives of ICTJ and the honorable speakers, for the opportunity granted to us to speak about quite a critical issue especially when it comes to the international liability regarding reparation. I will focus on the international aspect at the first level, whether the example at hand today, reparation, is it a unique example, or are there previous examples? Is the Truth and Dignity Commission, does it have mandate for the provision of reparation? And this is one of the arguments invoked to reject, or the stakeholders, are they really interested, like the French government, the IMF, and the World Bank? And most importantly, we will try to see how this understanding can be enforced on the ground of reality. Regarding the question whether the Commission has mandate internationally, the mandate of the TDC is about sovereignty. Based on the rules of sovereignty, it is entitled to do that. For a simple, the two memoranda addressed to the French state, to the IMF and the World Bank, it started with the explanation of its its legal mandate based on constitutional provisions in all of the areas that TDC is entitled to do. The law, by virtue of law number 13, granted, of course, TDC to practice its TDC in addressing both memoranda and both has jurisdiction and competence. There are issues that cannot be subject to the statutes of limitations regarding international crimes. And we have two examples for international conventions, like the example of 1986 and the European Convention of 1974. The other counterparts cannot invoke the principle of the statutes of limitation. The request petitioned by the Commission, the only objection to the jurisdiction of the Commission, if there is any element regarding the statutes of limitation, regarding any bilateral agreement with the French government as regards the dropping of the statutes of limitations on the international crimes, and they are not related to comprehensive crimes pertaining to international humanitarian law, and they are not related to any bilateral agreements with the IMF or the World Bank the issue that we will discuss regarding reparation is no novelty at the international level. There's some kind of sensitivity when dealing with this issue, and there's some kind of apprehension at the official level. I have no requirement of a reservation here. I can speak freely. I refer to the practical experience at the official level. We can refer to the red lines when it comes to bargaining issue or reparation on any previous periods in general, not under the French occupation in particular. We have international examples that are available. We can use, by way of comparison, refer to the mistakes made or the legislation provided for by the Commission in terms of its international mandate. In 2008, regarding the Italy and Libya issue. Politically, it wasn't emphasized as regards the Italian occupation of Libya. In 22, there was a statement by the Belgian authorities regarding the Congo. And if we go back, the French President Jacques Chirac, in his speech in 2002, he acknowledged the mistakes committed during the example at hand with Tataouine. The focus in making international motions should make reference to statistics and there is no focus by the Tunisian state on the evaluation of what should be compensated. These petitions should be accompanied by statistics or figures, at least, or approximate figures. The official effort is inexistent almost regarding the liability of the parties like the French government, the IMF and the World Bank. Let's start with the French state. In terms of dealing with compensation, we have to consider the arguments that could be provided by the other side. We have to mention three landmarks. In 1881 up to 1956, that's the period of occupation and the direct responsibility of the French colonization and what happened in between. This period had witnessed the absolute responsibility of France under the label of protectorate, which is an occupation. This is a purely French responsibility in a country that is colonized. We refer to Tazarka events and other historical events in Jimna. And this had a negative impact on the country's human and economic potential. The second period from the 20th of March 1956 up to the joint, if you like, sovereignty with France, where we have the French responsibility as regards the relationship of Tunisia abroad. So the damage was not in Tunisia particularly. The prejudice was sustained abroad. We have the incidents of Bizat and there are events that took place in Tataouine. And there was afterwards an effort to set up sustainable channels to dominate the resources of the countries and to dominate the educational system. The third period is after the end, the full independence period up to 2011. There was support for dictatorships that had been in Tunisia, and the support was political by international organizations through positions and through endorsement. And this is triggers political responsibility. And we can take the example at a given time, the popular efforts, protests during the revolution. That entails political responsibility. The IMF and the World Bank. What these two parties? Why did the TDC resort to these two institutions with this motion? Let's sum it up in a simple and clear frame. The indebtedness policies, as known through certain examples, resulted in Tunisia in the period before 2011 to full-fledged indebtedness to civil commotions. These civil commotions, when we speak about international institutions, usually these institutions are governed by the UN institutions in terms of their interventions. The World Bank and the IMF note that the indebtedness policies and the piled up debts led to the economic weakness and deterioration of the country and led to the social commotion and the social turmoil had impacted the region in general, and its consequences could be linked up with what came to be called under the UN that if you like, disturbance of international peace. These two institutions are connected directly with this issue. If we go back to the beginning of the issue of indebtedness, based on the statistics that are available and the home statistics, and in accordance with the international reports, there's a rising unemployment, there's deterioration of the social fabric due to the economic instability and absence of any post oversight after a disbursement of these loans and credits. In fact, the rule stipulates that there is improvement of the economic profitability, and not to complicate the economic profitability, we noted that it wasn't important for the lending international institutions. There's also oversight for the earmarked funds, and this is the crux of the matter regarding the corruption in Tunisia. Did the World Bank and IMF use these statistics during the bargaining period with the Tunisian authorities? Let's give a clear example. In the corona crisis, Iran requested a loan from the IMF to counter the coronavirus, but the bank objected to that because this country had previously exceeded and there were embezzlement of previous loans with regard to the countering of the earthquake crisis. And therefore, there was corruption. And based on that corruption and the absence of accountability, the IMF rejected the loan. If we take the example of Tunisia, we have also resorted to the IMF. Today, there's a report by the Ministry of Health in Tunisia, and there's a contract with a private company for 800,000 dinars to organize campaigns for vaccination. A country in economic crisis contracts with a private company to organize citizens in vaccination centers, as if this country has no other alternative, no civil society or army that could really come into play to organize vaccination campaigns. This is how we should understand the situation in terms of the arguments of the used for both memoranda or motions addressed to these two institutions and to the French state. Let's come back to Tataouine in particular. Tataouine was subjected to the three periods already explained, the period of occupation, and then after 20th of March, and then after the final evacuation of the French forces from. There's an international legal arsenal that covers the issue. The most important element that we can use in the international legal arsenal, and the simplest upon which we can build a whole solid fight, is Rule 150 in the international humanitarian customary law, that stipulates that the state shall undertake its responsibility in enforcing international humanitarian law by providing compensation for losses or any prejudice that resulted from its side. The issue here is that proving the prejudice and the accumulation of prejudice raises an evidentiary foundation issue, because we need experts and we need a clear-cut evaluation by experts to be used as a reference in the entire process, to make reference to in order to determine the motion. Now, for the fair compensation breaks down into 4 categories. The reparation, we have full reparation, we have distribution or compensation, and satisfaction. What I noted in the Commission's memo, it requested 3 petitions or motions. It requested something related to a satisfaction, that is the acknowledgement of responsibility. At a different level, it requested some kind of compensation that has been classified as violation, but compensation pertains to specific acts. Prejudice is specific and defined. When we refer to occupation crimes or an occupation period, and when, even in terms of diplomacy, the term of full reparation or compensation, or the comprehensive reparation of a given situation, doesn't mean returning the condition to the previous situation of status quo. We are returning to where it was. We are in 2021. We cannot restore the situation back to occupation time or to the earlier period. And the act and the accumulation of the facts, and we know the consequences of the acts in its structure. There is a regional disparity, which is the consequence of the occupation by focusing on the coastal areas to transfer the Tunisian resources and riches abroad. The Tunisian state stopped short of fulfilling its obligation of developing the infrastructure and maintained to a similar extent the policy of the occupation, even for the rehabilitation of roads and transportation. We still have a picture upon which we can build this perception. There will be a report that I will send to you in this regard. The issue could be addressed from 2 standpoints. Yes, there is a request for a compensation and an acknowledgement, but the acknowledgement will not serve the marginalized areas. To the best case scenario, it would be a starting point for further requests for compensation. We may request a reparation based on acknowledgement. This requires political negotiations, and we know the difficulty of that in view of the current political situation. Best of all, now the Commission made recourse to the French state, to the IMF and the World Bank. France is a member of the Council of the World Bank and in the IMF. As a proposal, I think it would be better and best to alleviate the pressure on the other party. We have to seek a way to make a way for the French state to assume part of the Tunisian foreign debt as a form of reparation, because alleviating the burden of foreign debt on Tunisia, because the debts at the level where they are very burdensome. For instance, France could assume a large part of the foreign debt of Tunisia through IMF and the World Bank. Within a diplomacy and within any negotiation scheme, we try to avoid, France, its part, will try to avoid this political embarrassment, and it's very difficult to persuade France to come to the table of negotiation. If we could make it under the framework of a bilateral cooperation, which would derogate France from any political responsibility, because from recognizing the crime occupation, this will incite France to proceed with the coverage of a large part of Tunisia's foreign debt. And internally, we should focus on reparation in terms of sharing responsibility or cooperation instead of seeking condemnation, something that has been overlooked by the Commission. The request for reparation for the crimes of occupation could be done individually. The international law authorizes submission of individual motions as regards the responsibility of any human rights violations. The Tunisian citizens who have submitted files to TDC could lodge lawsuits against the French state, and this is feasible. I'm going to draft the report and give you a copy. Thank you for this very exhaustive presentation and very interesting presentation, Mr. Haytham. We are behind schedule and we have to open a quick discussion about the first session before we move on to the second session that will be moderated by our colleague Sharaq from Solida. If there are comments or any participation, please by show of hand or by making a request to speak and to take the floor. Likewise, for our brothers and sisters in Tataouine, if you wish speak, there's someone who asked to speak from Tataouine. Dr. Ali Seki, please use the microphone. In a couple of minutes, please. Thank you very much. Thank you all. So I will go to the core of the matter. I know this can linger on for hours. On the 29th of May, 1956, is the decisive date from which we can start. Who killed the martyrs in Agri? Is it the Tunisian state or the French state? For those, and regarding the issue of dignity, the organization that tried to provide justice for these martyrs did something that drew the attention, which is to bury some of the bones at night in one of the cemeteries. With regards to marginalization is still in progress. those concerned in the civil society and the intellectuals in Tataouine have not heard about this workshop or any other previous workshops. As regards the recommendations, we have previously addressed these recommendations in the workshop in 2019, December. And one of the recommendations, some of the recommendations do not need further reorganization, because when we say that the ordinary citizens can lodge lawsuits, can individually lodge lawsuits against France. Who are those individuals who will proceed with these lawsuits, especially that the children of these people do not know anything about the fate of their fathers? In the municipality of Tataouine, these martyrs are still registered as alive. How can we put on a memorial that he's a martyr, and in the municipality of Tataouine, this person is still alive and the records of the municipality? How can we submit a lawsuit against France collectively? What documents are we going to produce? What is our evidence? Do we have really compelling evidence that we can produce that could be overriding enough to ensure obtaining our rights? There have been many verbal narratives that are not structured, that are not that are devoid of any compelling evidence to really use against France. Can we proceed with this evidence in international courts and really win cases? These cases are doomed to failure. I'd like to ask, as a Tataouine citizen, I'd like to speak about the funds that have been buried in the cemetery of Tataouine. Those whose bones have been buried, and why were they buried in that fashion? Exclusion and recommendations. We have a lot of comments, but in the interest of time, I hand it back to you. Thank you, Dr. Ali. 30. I think Mr. Mansour Khabir next to him is dying to intervene. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for this opportunity. We cannot indulge in the specifics regarding the reservations on transitional justice. And I know very well that with regard to transitional justice, we need to rectify this file, especially with the case of the Agri battle. We need to rely on the experts, and the Truth and Dignity Commission is relying in its final report on some narratives of some of historians like Marsoufi, part of which is in the report of the TDC. But despite that, the TDC has denied this research, or probably decided not to listen to the victims and the relatives of the victims of the Agri battle and those who took part in the Agri battle. I think we have run out of witnesses we have the testimony of Mr. Muhammad Saad Shibani, who is an expert in the fight. And most importantly, the question is not addressed to you, but to the Truth and Dignity Commission. What about the remains that had been buried? These remains that have been buried, and based on the forensic doctor, these remains have been taken from a reserve in a different area. Can you speak? Can we really talk about a battle related to national liberation in which 73 martyrs had died? These remains could refer to some animals and the name of the martyrs of the Agri battle. We are willing to take charge of all expenses to exhume these remains for laboratory analysis to prove that they are not the remains of the martyrs, and to overcome these issues. But there's an effort to hide the truth. There is no cemetery with the remains of the Agri battle martyrs or any museum. What we need is rehabilitation. We cannot speak about reparation without truth seeking. We are seeking national reconciliation. We in Tunisia have suffered for the injustice committed during the 23 years of tyranny and the period before. I think the Agri mountain battle is the starting point, and we have to have a genuine will to overcome these shortcomings. And with regard, the transitional justice process needs to be corrected and adjusted in order to ensure truth seeking is really made. Thank you, Dawi Musa. Mr. Dawi Musa would like to
أهلا. في هذه الورشة في تطاوين. سأحاول أن أكون موجزة قدر الإمكان في التقديم لهذه الجلسة. الجلسة الأولى تعلقت أساساً بالإجابة عن سؤال كيف تكون هذا الحق، حق جهة تطاوين في الكرامة والعدالة وجبر الضرر، وتطرق مختلف المتدخلون إلى الفترة اللاحقة لها والفترة الأخيرة السابقة ل 2011 نعم. وفي النهاية مادية ومعنوية ملموسة لصالح هذه الجهة، وذلك بهدف رفع الضيم الذي تحدث عنه مطولا الأستاذ الضابي، ورتق الضرر العابر للأجيال، والذي اتفقت مختلف المداخلات تقريبا على كونه يمثل انتهاكا مستمرا في الزمن وجريمة مستمرة في الزمن. نرجو أن تكون كما يضمن القانون ذلك على الأقل لا تسقط بالتقدم حتى يتسنى لنا في المستقبل القريب يعني جبرها ومعالجتها. المتدخلون في هذه الجلسة هم السيد
Hello, can you hear me? Interpreters? Hello? All right. Good. Yes, good afternoon, Aslema. I'm sorry I can't be in Tunisia. I have been to Tataouine many times, so I'm glad that we are able to do this activity even during the pandemic, and I hope you are all safe and healthy in Tunis as well as in Tataouine. I only have about 10 minutes, so I won't take very long. First of all, let me go directly into some of the questions that any discussion of reparations for marginalized regions must answer. And this applies whether we are talking of Tataouine in Tunisia or any other region in the global south in developing countries that sees itself as marginalized. And I will go to some examples later. First of all, it's important to define marginalized. What do we mean by marginalized? There have been attempts in Tunisia, including before the Truth and Dignity Commission, to come up with a definition. And I understand that the Truth Commission had difficulty defining marginalization. Even with the assistance of organizations such as the FTDES, the Federation on Social and Economic Rights, or even with some inputs from different NGOs and places that consider themselves marginalized, whether it's Kasirin or GAFSA or Avocats Sans Frontières. I think that process also taught us a lesson that there will be different definitions of marginalization. And I think it's important to acknowledge that so that we do not attempt to come up with a single definition of marginalization that applies to any region that considers itself marginalized. I think it's important to recognize that economic and social policies that were adopted by colonial powers, such as France in Tunisia, or Spain in Colombia, or the British in Kenya, will have different impacts on different communities. And even in Tunisia, colonization obviously had different consequences across the country. There was marginalization in the south, but there was development in many ways in the coastal areas facing Europe. So we cannot have a single definition of marginalization. What we can try to have is a qualitative description of why a region is marginalized. And some of you have discussed this earlier. There was mention, for example, of the fact that Tataouine did not have a secondary school until much later in its history. In my first visit to Tataouine, I heard people from Tataouine talk about what they need, and one of those needs is a university-level hospital in Tataouine. So different regions, even different people, will have qualitative descriptions of what it means to be marginalized, what it means not to have things, and therefore what you should have, what you should get, so that you don't feel marginalized. And I'm sorry, it's very simplistic, but I think it's a way of addressing both the qualitative side and also the quantitative side. On the quantitative side, there have been attempts to quantify the impact of marginalization. Again, there were discussions in the past over how many schools Tataouine would need, or how many hospitals a marginalized region would need, the capacity of those hospitals, how many beds should there be. And I think those are important steps that have to be taken. This relates to a second point that I will make. What forms of reparation can correspond to the different definitions of marginalization that different regions will have? So in some places, reparations, Jaber Darar, reparations, and I'll make this clear for the interpreters, we will use Jaber Darar for reparations, we will use Tawidat for compensation, okay? Interpreters? Hello? I'm waiting for the interpreters to acknowledge that that's what we will use.
Yes, Mr. Ruben, we can hear you loud and clear. Please proceed.
So we will use the term compensation as money and reparations when we talk about collective reparations. So in some countries, you have different forms of individual reparation. Some of them can include employment, and this is one of the forms of reparation that has come up in Tunisia. There are also collective forms of reparation, and in some countries, this has been in the form of access to public services. And some of you have mentioned this, schools, for example. In Kenya, when we were doing consultations with mothers in a community that had suffered marginalization as well as massacres in the history of Kenya. The mothers specifically said they wanted a playground for their children as a form of reparation. So this can be very concrete and very specific. But what about for marginalized regions? In some countries, and I will discuss them right after this, one way of addressing marginalization has been to dedicate a specific percentage of the state budget to the development of that marginalized region. So let me repeat that. One way of addressing marginalization has been to dedicate a specific percentage of the state budget for development for a certain region. So this has, for example, been attempted in Kenya, where they have what they call an equalization fund for different regions to equalize the levels of development in these regions. I will now go to some slides and will show you examples from Morocco and Peru, and then mention some other examples as well. So Nade, can you go to the slides? Can you share it on the screen from slide 15? Sure. No, is it difficult? So I'll give two examples that we are familiar with. Peru is one example where there has been reparations that are collective, but really can be described as addressing the marginalization of a region. In Peru, the Truth Commission recommended reparations for regions that experienced the most violence during an internal armed conflict in Peru between the state and a rebel group called Sendero Luminoso. So what the reparations agency in Peru did was to offer specific amounts of money for regions that had the highest number of casualties during the conflict. There were amounts of money that were distributed to each of these regions, not to all the regions in Peru, but to the marginalized regions defined according to the number of casualties they suffered. But at the same time, the Peruvian government also took into account the level of economic development in these regions using data from a conditional cash transfer program that was being implemented by the Peruvian development agencies. Is the slide being shared? I don't see it. No? Okay, let me just... Okay, so in Peru, you have this data about how many communities were identified as marginalized and therefore entitled to reparation, how much in funding they received, and of course this is old data, but it shows you how many communities registered and then were given reparations. What's important to take note here are two things from the Peruvian example. First, each community had to have a committee that included at least 2 women, so 5-person committee with 2 women to make decisions together with the members of the community on how they would spend the reparations funding that they received. So that's one. Second, they had a registration process for marginalized regions seeking reparations for their community. So there's a committee that does consultations, and it has to have female or gender representation. And then there's a process for registering. So each community, let me just go back to that. So each community received that amount of money, and some of them chose different forms of collective reparations for their marginalized community, whether it's schools, electrical connections, or even cultural institutions for their community. Some of the symbolic forms of reparation were also established, but this one is an example from the Peruvian capital. So this applies to all those who were martyred, who were killed during the war in Peru. This is an example of the combination of collective symbolic reparations and individual reparations. These stones that are in that memorial contain the names and the ages of the persons who died and the year they died if known. So you can combine symbolic forms of reparation with collective forms of reparation, as well as reparations for marginalized regions. So for Tunisia, and this is in Sidi Bouzid, and I took this picture, there have been attempts at memorialization, but what other forms of collective reparations as well as reparations for marginalized regions are possible in Tunisia? So the next example is Morocco. And here you have a description of the events that took place in Morocco that led to a truth commission being established and a reparations program for individuals and for regions that were marginalized as a result of the repressive policies of the former king, the father of the current king, if I'm not mistaken. In Morocco, the system of reparations for marginalized regions requires different communities in a marginalized region, and there were, I think, 11 marginalized regions, if I'm not mistaken. But different communities in each of these marginalized regions will propose a project with an accompanying budget to be funded by the state reparations agency. So you have different forms of collective reparations in a larger marginalized regions. They submit project proposals. They are assisted in drafting their project proposals by the state reparations agency. And in turn, the state reparations agency is assisted by an economic planning institution that has experience in developing economic proposals for the state. So this is Morocco. And these are examples of collective reparations. This is a building in Casablanca, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Which used to be a police headquarters building, but they converted it as a form of reparations for the neighborhood into housing for the neighborhood. This is a poor neighborhood. This was a neighborhood that had opposed the king and was subjected to repression. So what the reparations agency did was to, in fact, in turn, convert this building into a residential building for the neighborhood. This is also still in Morocco. One other project example is farming of dates funded by the government as a form of collective reparations. So you have different examples, and I won't I won't use up all the time so that you have questions, you can ask them or you can make comments. But I also would emphasize that it's important to make sure that when we carry out symbolic forms of reparation, we do not forget to bring in material forms of reparation, especially for marginalized regions that don't have access to public services. This is an example from northern Iraq, a community that was subjected to the use of chemical weapons during Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in that country. This is a town called Halabja in northern Iraq. When the United States government first invaded Iraq and occupied the north, they put up a memorial funded by the US government for the victims of the chemical poisoning in Halabja. So they put up this memorial, and this is the road going to that memorial in Halabja in northern Iraq. But this is an actual road in Halabja, a very poor town with little services, with no access to electricity in many parts of the town. So in one of the commemorations of the Halabja chemical bombing, protesters went to the memorial and started setting it on fire to protest the fact that they had collective symbolic reparations, but they did not have collective material reparations. So it's important to make sure that when we design and implement reparations for marginalized regions, we honor the region. We honor those who fought against dictatorship, those who fought against colonization. We acknowledge them. It's also equally important to seek the acknowledgement of those who marginalized the region. And some of you have mentioned this in the discussion so far, a discussion of whether France should apologize or whether the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund should acknowledge their roles in marginalization and not just acknowledge symbolically, but acknowledge materially to financial assistance or even by forgiving the debt of Tunisia so that Tunisia can use that money to allocate development funding for specific marginalized regions. Just a final point here, and I know that the people of Tataouine as well as activists and victim groups leaders in Tunisia are really passionate about reparations and are really pursuing the implementation of reparations even in the difficulty brought about by the pandemic as well as the economic crisis in Tunisia. What I'm sad about is that after maybe several years of working in Tunisia and trying to involve not just Western governments, but multilateral institutions as well as UN agencies in discussing reparations, I have concluded that there is not just lack of interest, but sometimes even disapproval by some of these agencies and institutions in discussing reparations for marginalized regions. It's unfortunate because these are some of the same UN agencies that were involved in the drafting of the transitional justice law in Tunisia. And the Tunisian transitional justice law is very clear. It includes reparations for marginalized regions. It includes discussing accountability and justice for reparation for marginalization. And I don't know why some UN agencies, for example, seem to be very selective in what reparations they want to talk about or that they want Tunisians to talk about. They will talk about memorialization. They will probably talk about individual compensation. But I have not heard any of the UN agencies in Tunisia talk about reparations for marginalized regions that call for an acknowledgement by France for colonial abuses and by the World Bank and the IMF for economic policies imposed on Tunisia. Why is that? Why would the UN and its human rights and development agencies not acknowledge the findings of the very Truth and Dignity Commission that they funded, that they helped organize and establish? So I think it's also important for our colleagues who are not Tunisians, who work in Tunisia, to understand that while they may have ideological reservations, They may not be as radical in their notions of what reparations can be. It's important to respect what the Tunisian Truth and Dignity Commission has recommended. It's important to respect what the people of Tataouine and Tunisians in general say is a form of justice that they need. And the UN agencies in Tunisia, as well as the foreign governments who are supporting transitional justice in Tunisia, should no longer be selective, should no longer only support the specialized chambers or symbolic reparations while ignoring poverty, ignoring marginalization, ignoring unemployment, and ignoring inequality brought about by colonial rule and by neoliberal economic policies of the World Bank. So let me stop there and have a further discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruben Carranza, for this exhaustive and rich presentation as regards comparative experiences. I try to sum up your intervention in two main ideas. The first idea, you highlighted the importance to distinguish between the two concepts of reparation and compensation to clearly understand the components upon which transitional justice process rests and for the victim regions. And the second idea is about the specificity of the experiences and the importance of involving victims in the mode of reparation and to achieve transitional justice in keeping with their needs. You made reference to several experiences. You've raised some various experiences of comparative experiences, and you said that we should not settle with symbolic reparation and the importance of material compensation to ensure that the most urgent needs of the victim regions are achieved and to ensure proper address of their needs. Before I hand over to Mrs. Thoraya, I'd like to remind that we took note of those who requested to speak, Mr. Amar Shwat, Mr. Bushiba, Mr. Khidri, and Mr. Mohammed Hadi Biltay. There are those who are following on Zoom or on Facebook Live. They can share their questions. Mrs. Thoraya Bikri, the coordinator of the promotion of good governance and democratic institution in UNDP, we would like to see how can accountability, transparency, and good governance contribute in achieving development in marginalized regions, especially that Article 14 of the Constitution institutionalized this aspect. Your presentation will be quite relevant because it will highlight the main aspects pertaining to reality. Hello, everyone. I thank ICTJ for this invitation and my greetings to all present, those here in Tataouine, in Tunis, and through the online communication media. My presentation will be technical as requested. Through our work and through comparative experience, I am going to present, I'm going to show how the promotion of integrity, accountability, transparency, and good governance and anti-corruption, how can these contribute to achieve development in marginalized victim regions and provide justice for these regions. There's an intrusive voice from one of the speakers. I think we have resolved this issue. How can the promotion of accountability, transparency, good governance, and integrity achieve development in victim marginalized regions and provide justice for these regions to achieve economic, social, environmental, and gender-based justice, and how we can include the approach of accountability as a major factor in designing transformative policies in order to achieve this justice. When we speak about transformative strategies, we are striving to ensure that these strategies can change the systems, that they can change certain conduct, certain mindsets and moralities, and leave palpable effect that is measurable in terms of the change achieved regarding developmental impact, a comprehensive development that is integrative development whose core is a human being. In practical terms, how can we use these tools available in terms of accountability in order to transfer the regions from the situation that they have been in for years to the situation of areas where growth and development are taking place? There's something that we have to agree upon from the start. Victim region may be the result of an entire system, and this region has been targeted as a region, and this targeting has continued. This system includes the law enforcement, the political dimension, the judicial dimension, the cultural, educational dimensions, the media also dimension is involved. When we have a corrupt media, this allows an entire region to be marginalized and to be completely left out from developmental coverage, and hence the suffering witnessed by these people nationwide. We are going to address not only the developmental dimensions pertaining a given area, but we are speaking about full-fledged systems. The most important aspect is that the region and its representative, we are referring here to the components of the region, be it the civil society, media, private sector, public institutions, and this is important to have a joint perspective among all these stakeholders and components. These components have to monitor the national process of reforms. The report of the DC in many chapters made reference to the importance of institutional reforms. But as we speak about promoting development in victim regions, we cannot just consider the chapter of victim regions and the reforms thereof. We have to consider the approach in its comprehensive aspect, because corruption becomes widespread when human rights are undermined, when a human rights system, other human rights systems are undermined, and the other institutional entities in general. There are three chapters. There's underlying aspects here. We have to continue working on certain aspects, three aspects in specific: the non-recurrence of the system of corruption, the chapter about institutional reform, the judiciary, law enforcement, the media, the political system, reparation for victim regions, and also anything pertaining to non-repetition. These apply to all victim regions. There are, of course, specificities regarding our region, and most importantly, we have to consider this the aspect of Tataouine. Tataouine has two specificities. It is a border crossing area, and we are all familiar about the importance of cross-boarding areas in terms of consecrating smuggling and contraband. There's also a dimension pertaining to the custom department mentioned in the report of TDC. So we have to monitor all the reforms in that aspect. It is also a region where there is this kind of extractive industries, manufactures for mineral wealth. There's also a specific characteristic of corruption, but thank God, and it is one of the tools of anti-corruption in this area. In addition to monitoring the general reforms in terms of anti-corruption efforts and the extent to which the Tunisian state has progressed in enforcing the anti-corruption UN convention and in implementing, in drafting laws and implementing laws, and to have the necessary resources to change the systems. There's also a regional and local and sector-based dimensions that I will address one by one. As previously mentioned, it is important for the developmental perspective to be a joint perspective, and it's important to focus on the dialogue mechanisms and and this democratic participative approach that has been consecrated in the constitution at the local and regional level. The table should involve all the stakeholders without neglecting the institutional party, because with that we can advocate the enforcement of these developmental programs at the level of the central authority. We cannot talk about the central power today, but the central party. This approach from the outside should be participatory in terms of the consultations, in terms of in monitoring execution, in allocating budgets, and it's one of the tools of development at the local level. The third point is that today there is a whole approach at the international level when it comes to holding corruption to account as regards the tools used. What we figured out today is that for years, unfortunately, those working on anti-corruption, working separately from those working on development, and the gap between the two sides, these two communities, results in the absence of a strategy to combat corruption in developmental programs, be it developmental programs at the central and local, national or regional. Since from the outset, as we start working on developmental plans, we need to integrate the anti-corruption approach. That is essential from the elaboration until implementation and evaluation, and by earmarking the funds for that. Transparency, accountability, and integrity, has a price tag, of course. But I wouldn't consider this as a price tag, but rather as an investment. When you digitalize some of the administrative functions to improve their transparency, that entails expenses that will be reimbursed for a better use of these local funds, In this approach, it is essential that we include the anti-corruption approach in the plans. The third point is about the capacity building at the regional and local levels for everything pertaining to accountability, anti-corruption, and transparency. What we mean by capacity building, building the capacity building of the civil society, the private sector, and the public sector, and the state-run institutions. That should be self-evident, but it is not, in fact, because not all regional administrations see their capacity building improved. Not all municipalities, not all associations. Today we have associations working, for instance, on employment, for instance. It is essential that we know the mechanisms, what anti-corruption laws are available, so it could have access to information to ensure that its proposals and monitoring is based on scientific evidence, so that it has the proof and evidence to prove that the fund allocated has been provided or not, if there is any delay in completion aspects, if there are associations that could interconnect at the local level and at the local level and with the national entities specialized in anti-corruption. I now come to the sector-based approach. For extractive industries and manufacturing, there's a whole expertise. There's a Tunisian association specialized in expertise about extractive expertise. If we have local activists in Tataouine who work on development, these associations should have the mechanisms to monitor what is happening at the level of the exploitation of the natural wealth, to keep a close eye on procurement and contracts, to monitor the social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, which is part and parcel of the programs on the agenda. These associations come to know whether these projects have been completed or not. Has completion been done in accordance with the progress decided from the outside? Is there any conflict of interest in terms of the financing certain projects? Is there illicit enrichment? Is there any nepotism as regards employment? All of these mechanisms are there to ensure that these areas become pilot regions in combating corruption, thus creating a specialty or an expertise that would promote to the development of that region and to promote the social economy in that area. Corruption at the level of environment, it has its culture, it has its tools. Everything pertaining to open governance, the open data, everything pertaining to budget monitoring and participatory budgeting, I haven't heard much mentioned, which is quite important in many of the proposals and recommendations of TDC's report. There's a recognition of, there's acknowledgement of a systematic marginalization of some women in certain regions. And this is one of the requirements of development. There are mechanisms to access information. There are also budget mechanisms gender-based, gender-prone budgeting that would incite activists and citizens monitor the progress of national programs implementation, and whether the state is really involved in combating inequality, and whether the state is dealing with all regions on equal footing. We made reference to the developmental paradigm for specific regions. There are mechanisms in play for that issue. You all know that each country and each area has what we call the national or local integrity systems, which is a survey to assess the tables of integrity, the judiciary, the court of audit at the local regions, the presence of the Anti-Corruption Commission. So there has to be some work assessing the regional system, what is available and what we aspire to, and how we can work on that aspect, and we can rationalize funding to support these systems. Last mechanism that I wanted to talk about, and that we experimented with within UNDP, what we call the Isles of Integrity, whereby at the local level or at the sector-based level, you decide institutions, associations. These institutions and associations decide to promote these mechanisms. As a victim region, there can be a request by some institutions to be involved in the integrity isles, these programs in association with the Anti-Corruption Commission and with the presidency of the government and the National Anti-Corruption Department. And we draft programs that are designed to improve the situation. This situation has been there for decades. We shall not achieve reform in 1 or 2 years. This work has to be on the long-term basis. We have to avoid past occurrences. If there is a national, if there is a national system that could provide consensus, that could provide, that can set the priorities at the short, medium, or long term, and so to decide what kind of developmental paradigm we want to embark on, what resources are available. The issue is about potential, about advocacy, and also it's also about monitoring and relying on figures and statistics. Of course, there has to be also a political will, but there's an opportunity today for the civil society to become active in designing new policies and developmental policies, and to monitor them by the same token. Thank you. Much, Mrs. Thuraya. I thank you for this valuable presentation.
Aiming at improving good governance to serve development in the region throughout two main axes, which are this approach need to be inclusive, comprehensive, and we talked about the importance of making justice comprehensive, to involve and include gender basis. Also, we need to respect equality between genders, and of course this requires the existence of a number of factors, and to include the civil society, the private sector, and the public sector. Also, you talked about how does Tataouine represent a model where good governance should serve development. You talked about the extractive industries, and I would like to conclude with an important issue, which is combating corruption and development, and the sectors that should attract the state's attention in development programs in the future. Now we move to discussion. We will try to be brief as much as possible. I give the floor to Mr. Ammar Shawat, Mr. Hossein Bushiba, Mr. Almi Khadari, and Mr. Haytham Biltaif. They will be allocated 2 minutes each. And there is one question from the expert, Mr. Ruben Karanza, to Mrs. Thuraya, which we will read later on. The floor is yours, Mr. Ammar. I would like first to be brief. I would like you to be brief in your answers, in your questions. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to all the attendees. And thanks to the ICTJ in Tunis and mainly Mrs. Gantry and Mrs. Ezer. I would like to talk about the marginalization of Tataouine as if it is a systematic policy, a systematic sanction perpetrated by the state, which continued up to the 2011-2012 period, and but for the efforts of the inhabitants of Tataouine, things would have remained the same. Inhabitants of Tataouine have built their own city. I would like to give you some figures. Tataouine, as a governorate, did not see any public investments in the region, while the other regions, the neighboring regions, the development budget is 10 times higher. This has resulted in a catastrophic social situation. We have very poor growth. People tend to leave Tataouine and go to other regions to work. People do not have, there is one doctor for 1,800 citizens, while the national level, the national average is one doctor for 700 inhabitants. The death rate at birth is double the national average. Illiteracy is 30%. Success in the national exams is the weakest or the lowest. Female unemployment is 52%, while it is 20% nationwide. So marginalization is a reality on the ground. These are figures which I have mentioned, despite the fact that Tataouine is a militant region, and we have waged a number of wars against occupation and against the French colonizer, and there were so many battles in Tataouine against occupation up to the 1956 period. We can remember battles of Wad al-Khil, the battle of, and many other battles. So all these battles and all these actions of militantism did not help Tataouine have a better future. In 2011, the consecutive governments after the revolution have all recognized the importance of Tataouine, and they have also recognized the fact that Tataouine has always been marginalized. But in fact, nobody has even endeavored to boost development in Tataouine. I can tell you an anecdote. They talked about positive discrimination. So Tataouine, the development budget in Tataouine is still so low. So it is imperative that the inhabitants of Tataouine and the MPs of Tataouine and political parties move to solutions. So there are solutions at the central level and solutions at the local level. And civil society and academics and specialists need to be there in Tataouine to push and force the state to boost development in the region. Based, of course, on the work of academics and university research. And we need, as civil society and as academics, to grab whatever we could from the state and force the state to enact laws in favor of investment in Tataouine. So the incentives given to those who invest in Tataouine should be much stronger than those who invest in the coastal regions. This is at the local, regional level. People in civil society, political parties, academics, and MPs need to boost development in the region. We need to coordinate with municipal councils, elected municipal councils. We have a number of municipalities in Tataouine, and we need to coordinate our efforts so that we come up with a roadmap to boost development in the region and to talk about the contributions of Tataouine in the colonial period. So that also we can build statutes for the martyrs of the fight against the French colonizer. And I do believe the municipal council be on the same wave with all the other activists in the region. So we need to avoid differences and problems. And we need to force the government to boost development in the region. We need to evaluate what we have, and of course, we need to work together to boost development. Thank you, Mr. Ammar. I do believe that the next workshops that will be held by the ICTJ will try to implement all these recommendations on the ground. Now we give the floor to Mr. Hossein Bouchiba. Thank you. Thanks for the ICTJ. Thanks for all those who have invited us and allowed us to talk. Personally, I confirm what and endorse what Mr. Ammar said. So the inhabitants of Tataouine should be the best defenders of Tataouine. TDC worked on all the aspects of the pre and post independence periods. We need to avoid contention and focus on agreement. Mr. Hamida, has got a personal problem for personal reasons. He talked about that problem for the remains of the martyrs that were collected from Agari. The second point I would like to talk about is the issue of our friend from Sfax has made an excellent presentation. So he was talking about compensation while he meant reparation. So the terminology that has to be used is reparation and not compensation. Also, we need to endorse the concept of rehabilitation before reparation. This is our dignity at stake. Unfortunately, the president of the state considers France as a protector of Tunisia and not a colonizer, while France is a colonizer. They colonized everything and they jeopardized everything. That's why Tataouine is entitled, even after generations, to reparation and to rehabilitation. This colonizing experience was atrocious. And of course, they need to apologize for what they did. Apart from reparation, they need to apologize for what they did before reparation. As Mr. Adawi said, I was shocked by the presentation of the ex-president of the Bar Association in Tunisia. If you can see, the literacy levels or development figures in the region, they are very low compared with the other regions. And this has been also proven by the TDC. I would like to make to formulate a demand for Tataouine. We need to gain access to running water. This is a constitutional right, and we are fully entitled to this right. And since the time I was in Tataouine, we have regular running water cuts during the summer period, together with other development issues. So thank you so much, the ICTJ, for allowing me this opportunity to talk. And we hope to have other opportunities to talk and to express the problems of Tataouine. Thank you so much, Mr. Hossein. Now we give the floor to Mr. Almi Khadri. The floor is yours, sir. Mr. Almi, can you hear us? Thank you so much. I fully hear you. Peace be upon you. All of you, all my respects and welcome to the attendees. Thanks to the ICTJ, who is still trying with many other civil society organizations to give an impetus to transitional justice in Tunisia, and to achieve at least part of the dreams of the militants in on the 16th and the 17th of December. What shall I tell to all these experts and to these academics and to these militants? Peace be upon you and welcome to you all. I will not talk about technical issues because I'm not a specialist, and I cannot pretend to be one. But in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I think the key reason for the non-achievement of all of the transitional justice is recognition. The old regime did not recognize its mistakes and its sins, and the people who are trying to find pretexts and justifications. I will read some excerpts of the TDC report, final report about development in the region. The report managed to find out the methodology of marginalization in the region, as was mentioned in the directive plan, development plan, which stipulates literally that while the internal regions are not prosperous, are not important for national development, that's why the national interest should exclude these regions because there is no economic efficiency. That's why development should be based on the coastal regions. So there is nothing more clear than this. And according to what we know about the previous regime and their approach in dealing with development in the region, we know all that. And as the ex-president of the Bar Association said, the coastal regions were not that developed, and there are many internal regions which were left without development, like Janduba and Kasreen and Tbarka. And there were even coastal regions which remained underdeveloped in Tunisia. And unfortunately, I blame the deep state because they did not recognize their mistakes and they did not admit their mistakes, and they did not pay tribute to the martyrs of the region. And many martyr remains are not identified yet. This is a source of anger and discontent. Marginalization of the region is organically related to human rights violations. We discovered that many symbols of militantism in the region have been marginalized. For example, Dr. Monsef Ben Salem, the neighborhood where he lived as a child remained without any development. Because we are still watching the legacy of the previous regime by the and nobody wants to recognize and admit their mistakes. The proponents of the previous regime are those who advocate theocracy and autocracy. And as Mr. Carranza said, reparation, the region is entitled to full reparation a material reparation and not only moral reparation. But we still did not receive any apology from the perpetrators of the violations. There is no apology from the state for the violations perpetrated. We do not know where to go or what are the future horizons. So the state started to give, when the United States invaded Iraq, they requested the other countries to exempt Iraq from paying its debt. And this strategy should be also implemented in Tunisia. So the way ahead is still unclear. And we need to do more and to militate more so that to get our rights. Thank you so much, Mr. Almi. Mr. Mohammed Haytham Beltaif, the floor is yours, sir. Do you want to respond or to bounce back on what he said? Yeah, with regards, I did not talk about studies conducted. The data available, because if you want to file a case to in international institutions, the situation here is different. Any action needs to be evaluated, materially evaluated. And I did not say that there are no studies, but the studies are there, and we thank them for their efforts. Now I talk about reparation and compensation. So we cannot talk about returning to normalcy. The term compensation involves the violation and the consequences of the violation. So there were discrepancies in development which were committed. All this approach cannot be adopted in the absence of detailing and having figures, and that's the responsibility of the state. The state has relinquished its responsibility or disavowed its responsibility to evaluate, materially evaluate what happened. So we lost the case against Libya. The maritime borders in Al Jorf, continental Jorf, because the file was not well evaluated and well presented by the Tunisian state. So that's why there is a big difference between compensation and reparation. How can we start the process? You know, international negotiation is so complex and so technical. If the internal house is not well organized, the political tendency might lead to losing the negotiation. Recognition could be internal and external and international. Recognition will not give jobs to people, but recognition as the starting point for compensation, that's a good start. We can have two processes in parallel: recognition and at the same time compensation. The data available so far are very important, but the content of the international files are totally different. I mean, internal recognition is different from external recognition. And the studies conducted by the TDC are very good. But however, we cannot talk about this considering the state as a legal entity. And of course, the state recognizes all the shortcomings of the previous regime and internal recognition, even if the Tunisian state recognizes its mistakes in the past. But are you, as an international stakeholder, will you recognize your violations or not? Tunisia, in the current situation, even if we start a comprehensive process for reparation and compensation, we need to have a full-fledged project, and the UNDP could be a partner in this endeavor. Tunisia today does not have international negotiators capable of proposing things in this way. So the attempt to have a program to train international negotiators is a dilemma today in Tunisia, and we badly need to train international negotiators. And this falls within the competency of the UNDP. We have political alternatives today in Tunisia, which is the perpetuation of the same system, which
Of course, this is not a kind of criticism to the internal side, but unfortunately there is no clear program on this issue, and hence we have to really have a clear plan internally to face marginalization and reparation of the regions. The state should adopt this program, and then we can go to the international. Another final and concluding remark on the losses and drawbacks that Tataouine suffered from, which is still continuing until now. Today, we can say, for example, we can see the companies in Tataouine. The state is saying that we do not have natural resources. However, when it comes to the extractive industries, there are tens and tens of companies of extracting, and they are there is a lot of issues around the contracts of these companies. For instance, British Gas, until now, STEG, which is the national company of electricity, is still buying energy from British Gas, so on and so forth. That's why this is another issue that we should pay attention to. On extraction also, let's say that the most serious loss and injury to Tataouine, to the water resources due to the exploitation of water resources, that was maybe the huge and the most serious harm to Tataouine and to its resources. a company that is acting there in Tataouine according to a political agreement between the state and the government, and they do not recognize the company responsibility and the societal responsibility, and hence we should really recognize what happened there, technically speaking, and then we try to think about the reparations that would be suitable to Tataouine. Last but not least, the target of all of this discussion is to learn and to have lessons from our history and from our past experiences in relation to tyranny and oppression and repression. And then we should, of course, prepare a solid file that would enable us to go in the process of internationalizing the file of Tataouine. That's why we have to really focus first on the legacy of colonization, which is maybe more heavy or heavier than the other forms of reparation. And recognizing the moral obligations and moral responsibility of colonization is another part of the reparations. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. Yes, indeed, recognizing the responsibles of the harm, whether international parties or local parties, is of paramount importance, which leads us to the question raised by Ruben Carranza to Mrs. Thoraya. He asked about does UNDP's anti-corruption work in Tunisia recognize the accountability of the World Bank and the IMF for enabling, funding, and supporting Ben Ali's social and economic policies? Mrs. Thoraya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In reply to Mr. Ruben, and I'm sure he expects my answer, he knows that the programs have a preset framework. Our project was not supposed from the first place to address this issue in the first place. But the UNDP has its general policy not to interfere with the sovereignty of any country. And as it has been addressed in the previous presentation, there's the political will of the Tunisian state, and we have no say in that regard. We have to ensure not to interfere with sovereignty decisions and sovereign decisions. Secondly, UNDP since 2011 has been supporting the state of Tunisia and the people of Tunisia in terms of the transitional justice process, supporting TDC and all the associations and CSOs working in this field. And we are at least striving to sustain this support in order to enforce the recommendations of TDC in this regard, because we are adamantly believing that based on the UN conventions, we adamantly believe that a large part, this is a large part of the transition to democracy to enforce these recommendations. And if there is no new project to continue supporting the enforcement of TDC's recommendations, this means that all the topics addressed today regarding acknowledgement and recognition in terms of remembrance and commemoration and remembrance and memorialization, we are working on that to support the civil society and we are supporting other programs. There's also another point regarding public indebtedness. It is a crucial issue when as it touches upon fiscal justice, and because it affects also the people's rights and the upcoming generations. Because when I contract debts today, I am stepping on future generations' rights in terms of the balance or imbalance of public budgeting. The UNDP system has its own independent expert regarding public debts and the rights of future generations in terms of financial balances. This expert is visiting countries, including Tunisia. I think there are, of course, mechanisms. There are mechanisms. Who said that there aren't mechanisms is not accurate. There are mechanisms and there are ways of supporting any effort towards establishing these financial balances. And we would like to reiterate the sovereignty issue regarding the state of Tunisia. Thank you, Soraya. I think we have now come to the close of today's workshop. We have gone beyond the planned schedule by 1 hour and a half, and this is due to the rich discussion and debate with our friends in Tataouine, all the participants through Zoom who have followed us on Facebook platform. This workshop is only a part of a series of workshops that address the area regarding transitional justice. There's an upcoming workshop for the Tataouine region. There are a couple of words that are recurrent in their which are recognition and in the future. Truth seeking. There has been a report published by ICTJ, and we have to work on the issue of accountability, of course, even further, in order to consecrate the process of justice as a whole. Specialized criminal chambers have been working to ensure some kind of justice is being served. We have also exchanged so many good ideas about effective transformative